Hi everyone, welcome to Tales of Dread. And let me tell you, this episode has 3 great stories. First, a man who worked at Crater Lake was shocked to see a grey creature with no hair that moved quickly but stayed close to the ground. Then, in Grand Teton National Park, a seasonal worker saw something alive that they couldn't understand. Something with teeth like tusks and eyes as dark as coal. Last but not least, a man in Montana sees a red fireball in the sky that makes him think it's a UFO. So, if you're having fun with us, please click like and subscribe to help us keep going on this adventure. It really helps me a great deal. Thanks a lot. Let's talk about the stories that have happened over the years. I've heard stories about strange creatures and beings that people don't understand coming out of national parks. I've never had any of these things happen to me, so I've always wondered if these stories were true. So you can imagine how interested I was when I recently talked to a friend about this, and he said that his father-in-law always talked about seeing something strange, something that was definitely alive but didn't look like anything he had ever seen before, and that it happened decades ago. Of course, all of this got my attention. The fact that this happened to him in the 1960s while he was working at Crater Lake National Park in Oregon made it even more interesting. He was working on a trail project in the North Rim area of the caldera. He was clearing brush and making a lot of repairs. One night, he realized he had forgotten his work bag. So, right after he left work, he went back to the site to get it. He was on the North Rim and started walking along the path that led to where he worked. That's when he felt like something was watching him. He says he didn't know what it was at the time, but he knew it was there. He kept walking and soon heard a strange singing sound coming from the forest, like a woman or a child was out there. He says it was haunting and strange, and it seemed to be coming from the direction where he had been working, which made him afraid to keep going. He got so worried that he decided to just go back the next day and get the bag. So he turned around and started walking back to his truck. It wasn't long before he heard footsteps following him in the distance. He turned around but didn't see anyone, so he walked faster and kept going. At the same time, he heard footsteps following him again, this time keeping up with him. They walked when he walked and stopped when he stopped. He said it wasn't long before he had a strong feeling that something bad was going to happen. So, he started running toward his truck. Then, just as he was about to get there, he turned around and saw it. When he turned around, he could see the whites of 2 eyes staring at him from the dark. As he looked at the eyes, he also felt that strong feeling of evil again. The rest of the creature began to show itself to him slowly. What he saw was completely pale grey, and he said it stayed low to the ground but moved very quickly. At the same time, he said he was only about 20 feet away from it when he saw it. When he stopped at his truck, he said, it stopped and looked up at him with big black eyes that seemed too big for its head. It looked almost like an alien. It just looked at him and didn't move or blink. Then it quickly turned around and ran into the bushes. After being shocked for a minute or two, he moved forward to try to find it. He kept looking around for about an hour, but he couldn't find anything, not even a trace of it. He said that he had worked in the park for years and knew that area very well, so he was surprised that nothing out of place showed up. He then gave up and turned around to go back to his truck. He decided that, in good conscience, he didn't want to do that because he thought the creature might be dangerous and because there were people in that area every day. So, he went back to the place where he saw it. Now there were what looked like dog tracks, but they were bigger than they should have been. He also thought it was strange that each print looked like it had only 4 toes instead of the 5 that a normal dog would have. So, after trying for a few minutes to figure out what made these tracks, I looked at them again. While he was standing there, he felt very strange. He said that his mind seemed to go blank and that he couldn't remember why he was there or what had happened there. So he decided to leave the area and go home, which he did without any problems. But the next day at work, his boss called him and asked if he had seen anything strange in that area, since another worker had also seen something strange. He said yes and went on to describe a creature with grey skin, and eyes that looked like black holes. But his boss laughed off that description and tried to explain things that an unknown creature wouldn't care about. The boss was almost condescending about it, to the point where he made his friends and father-in-law look at the area again and look for the tracks with him. After looking around for a few minutes after they got there, he remembers that his mind seemed to go blank again. He passed out for a little while, just like the last time, and when he came to, his boss was gone. Then he looked at his watch and saw that more than 2 hours had gone by. Now that it was noon, he couldn't remember what had happened in the last 2 hours, which scared him. He walked back to the parking lot to see if his truck was there, and thank goodness it was. After he got in, he went straight back to the main building, where his boss was sitting in his office. He walked up to his boss's office and asked him what had happened. His boss just looked up as if nothing had happened and asked him how his day was going. At that point, my friend's father-in-law knew that what he was going through was not normal in any way. He even thought it might have been an alien or some other creature from another world messing with his mind, but he didn't know what it was that day. He went home early because he was very upset, but he said he didn't feel well. In the end, it seems to have taken him a long time to tell his story because it had clearly upset him a lot. Now, I've known the friend who told me this story about his father-in-law for a long time. He's a very honest guy who wouldn't make up stories to make people uncomfortable or laugh, and he told me this story exactly as I've told it to you, without adding anything. And his father-in-law was a very private person who didn't talk much about what he saw to anyone but his immediate family. So I'm sure he didn't make up the story. So, after hearing this story directly from the family, I thought maybe you all would like to hear it. That's why I'm telling you about it here. It looks like some of those national park stories might have more truth to them after all. I hope this is helpful. Many thanks. I had been working at Grand Teton National Park on a seasonal basis for about 3 years when this happened. I was working at Jenny Lake Campground in the summer of 1995. Since kids are going back to school in the middle to late part of August, the campground is usually pretty empty. On one of my days off, I decided to go hiking on the Phelps Lay Loop Trail just south of Jenny Lake. There were some clouds, but there was no rain or anything else bad in the forecast. I got to the trailhead at 10:30 and started hiking up through the woods until I got to an area where the main trail to the lake splits into several smaller trails. I turned left onto one of these smaller trails that I knew would eventually lead me back to the main trail. Then I hiked for about 1.5 miles before I noticed it was starting to get cloudy and windy. I thought it was strange because that kind of weather hadn't been in the forecast. The wind was coming off the mountain and blowing down. But I just kept hiking anyway. After walking a little farther, I stopped to enjoy the view for a few minutes. Before I turned around and headed back down the trail I had come up. Around this time, I saw something move about 30 yards away in the trees to my left. At first, I thought it might be a moose or elk because there are a lot of those animals in the area. As I watched to see what it was, it moved from tree to tree, staying behind them but getting closer to me, until it came out into an open area where I could see it better. When I first got a good look at it, it looked like something I'd seen in a National Geographic magazine, like an animal you'd see in a faraway country but not in what is basically your own backyard. It was about 7 feet tall and had reddish-brown hair all over its body. It also had a long snout with teeth that looked like tusks. This made me think of a warthog. The ears were small and straight up, and the eyes were dark. Then, in between the ears, there were these horns that looked to be about 8 to 10 in long. As I stood there for a few minutes trying to figure out what it was, I thought it might be a rare mountain goat or something like that. I was also trying to figure out if something like this even existed, since it didn't seem to belong in Wyoming. It started walking toward me at an odd angle, almost as if it didn't want me to see its whole body. Just the fact that it was walking that way was strange. But when it got within 15 yards of me, I saw that the front legs looked more like human arms than anything else. It was walking on them in a way that reminded me of apes. So, my brain had to work hard to figure out how to understand an animal that looked like it was part mountain goat and part ape. At this point, I was getting very scared because I didn't know what it was and it kept getting closer to me. Then, when it was about 10 yards away, I saw that the tips of the horns were very sharp, and the animal started to hold its head down so that the tips were pointing right at me. At this point, I was sure that this was some kind of rare breed of mountain animal or something like that, since nothing like this should exist. Now that it was only 5 yards away, it got even closer to me, and I could see its eyes much better when it looked up at me, probably to keep me in its sights. Then it looked almost like a person, except that its eyes were very big and black as coal, giving no sign of life. The face also looked like it belonged to an ape, with the mouth open. I could still see these teeth that looked like tusks, and it smelled like a wet dog mixed with something else I can't really put my finger on. I thought, if this thing attacks me, I'm dead, and then it did something that scared me even more than when it was coming at me with its horns pointed at me. It raised its head to the sky and started making a sound that was a mix of a human scream and an ape's hoot or howl. At this point, I turned around and ran as fast as I could back down the trail toward the main junction. I didn't turn around until I had run about a half-mile down the trail from where I had first seen this thing. When I finally turned around and looked back, I saw nothing. Everything looked normal and quiet. So I kept walking down the trail for another 1.5 miles until I got to where my car was parked. When this event happened, I didn't tell anyone about it. Not my family or my co-workers, because they would have thought I was drunk or something. My co-workers would be especially skeptical because they all knew that animal didn't live in those mountains. At least, most people who live nearby or work at the park say that. So I just put my head down and kept working. I did it every summer until I was in my late 20s, when I finally got married and settled down. I was eventually able to put this experience out of my mind and only think about it as if it were a movie or a book. But when the internet became more popular a few years later and I heard some stories on your channel Lilith, I realized I might never know exactly what I saw. I haven't heard anyone else describe it in detail, but I know it wasn't a mountain goat, an ape, or any other animal that lives in those mountains. It was nothing at all like that. How are you? I'm just sending you here to give you a quick explanation of something weird. I went through that about 5 years ago. When I was at my friend's house for a bonfire, we were all sitting around and talking when something caught our attention. The sky to the west looked like it was on fire, but there was no lightning or thunder, just a huge red glow. We could also see it really well because it happened in Montana, where the sky is big and you can see a long way in every direction. So, whatever this was seemed to start high in the sky and move toward the horizon. We watched this for about 15 minutes as it moved up and down over and over again until it went behind some trees. Now, we were always at his house. Even after that first night, we would still see lights flashing around his property, but nothing like what we saw that first night. A few months later, he was called into work early one morning. We had all stayed there for the night. when he got up, we were all awake. So, I and another friend decided to ride 8 TVs before sunrise, which is something that people here often do. So we went to a trail that goes through some state land where you can ride pretty much wherever you want. We were about halfway done when we came to a clearing and saw what looked like something on fire in the distance. But neither smoke nor a smell came from it. Just the same red glow we had already seen. Now, this thing was just above the ground, hovering there. Then, as we were looking at it, it shot straight up into the air and disappeared behind some low clouds. Even though I'd never seen a UFO before, I knew right away that this was one. I knew for sure. We didn't know what to do. So we turned around and went back to his house without talking about what had happened. The next day, my friend who owned the property asked if we had seen anything strange out there. He had a strange look in his eyes, and when I told him what I had seen, he said that he had seen something similar in the woods behind his house a few times but had never told us because he didn't want to look crazy. He also said that one time he was driving down a gravel road on his property at night and saw lights flashing around him, but he couldn't figure out why. So, after all that, we would occasionally see strange things, but nothing else. As crazy as what happened the first 2 times. Oh yeah. And lastly, the person who owns the property, a friend of mine, has been having strange electrical problems with his house for a while. Now, lights would turn on and off on their own, appliances would turn on even when they weren't plugged in, and so on. He thought there was a problem with the wiring or something similar. His phone would ring until he started having trouble with it. But then there wouldn't be anyone on the other end, and the call would end before he could hang up. I don't know if these things have anything to do with what we saw, but they happened around the same time as everything else we saw and heard. So I think there must be a link.